Over 80 episodes later, and we're into season 9. With my guests, we'll be diving into all things leadership, teamwork, engagement, mental wellbeing, and high performance. We have the conversations that really matter, that put the human factor back into business, because we know that when we get people right, we get business right. If you want to find out more about how to develop an experience that brings out the best in people, get in touch. I'm your host, Lisa, psychologist and psychotherapist and founder of It's Time for Change. Thank you for joining me on Beyond the Water Cooler. So I am joined today by Sophie Lodge, who's a financial advisor at 8 Wealth Management, and we're going to be discussing financial wellbeing. So welcome, Sophie. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
So we've only met once before in person, back in 2022. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so.
At an event, and immediately I liked your style because you're very down to earth and it's very you're very easy to relate to. And I love the fact that you describe yourself as a big sister in finance, because that's kind of like, it almost feels like you're that approachable person that I can ask all my daft questions and get some really good advice without any sense of judgment, which is exactly what we need in this space. So I am really looking forward to this opportunity to talk with you about a topic which, I guess, the term financial wellbeing, lots of people have heard for quite a long time, for quite a number of years, maybe don't actually know what that means. And maybe there's people are still restricted in terms of how they talk about it because of the sense of taboo and so on, around talking about money. So we're going to delve into all that today. Before we get into that, though, I would love to hear a bit more about you and your role and actually what makes you different in a world that has quite a lot of financial advisors in it. So I know from seeing you on LinkedIn and your presence there, you have a certain style, which I find very reassuring and warming and very natural. But what do you think makes you different?
I think the biggest thing for me is that I don't necessarily have that financial background. I took the very scenic route to becoming an advisor and started in wedding planning. And so I've kind of been on the other side of things where, there were all these financial questions, but I didn't know the answer. And I kind of think a lot of people get to that point where they have these questions, but they either don't know who to ask or they feel like you say like they're silly questions, and it feels like everybody else has the answers, and so you end up almost kind of burying your head in the sand a little bit and not wanting to kind of go anywhere with it. So I've kind of been on that side of the fence, and I think for me, I'm not, as you say, kind of the typical financial advisor that a lot of people would expect to see, and I definitely avoid using jargon when I'm talking to clients. Try and just keep it really simple, really accessible. I think that's the most important thing when it comes to finance. And yeah, there are no silly questions. I'm sure there'll still be things that I'll think of, through the week that, oh, actually, what's that? How does that work? In all sorts of areas. So I think the main thing for me is, like I say, being approachable, being somebody that people actually want to talk to. I never want anybody to think, oh gosh, I've got to go speak to my advisor, really daunting. It should be something exciting because, what we're building is your retirement, your future. And that should be something to look forward to.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's really interesting is that as you say, you don't have that background in finance and you've come from something very, very different.
Mhm.
And I think what you bring to it is then means you can be quite fresh in it. Yesterday I was talking at an event about business, and I was like, actually, I don't have a business background. Like that's not my background. My background as being a psychologist. But again, as soon as you hear that term, it's like, oh my gosh, that's kind of feels really formal. No, I'm not that formal person. I'm just someone who's actually really approachable and kind of that person who's by your side and can just help out when you need help with whatever you need help with. So yes, which is probably why I was kind of drawn to your approach, because that's I kind of see that in myself. So what I'm really keen for today is that in terms of people leaving is having a kind of a clear idea of, I guess, what the financial climate is doing or how it's impacting on people. And to actually, we hear all this stuff in the news, and to actually bring that closer to home, think actually, how's that impacting on the people around me at work? And also,
Yeah.
what can we do to support the people we are working with? So those are kind of the two um, key aims I'm hoping that people will leave with. What I thought was really interesting, because obviously we hear a lot about the cost of living crisis,
Mhm.
but the report published yesterday by the Social Metrics Commission, which I was staggered. I heard this morning on the news when they were talking about some of the figures that came out of it, and found that the rate of poverty in the UK is now higher than at any other point in the 21st century. And this is the bit that shocked me. Nearly 1 in 4, so 24% of people in the UK now are judged to be in poverty, which is pretty shocking.
Yeah, it's one of those things as well. I mean, a lot of the people that I deal with, when we're kind of submitting our advice and that kind of thing, one of the boxes that we have to tick is an area that says if a client has children, at what point will those children no longer be financially dependent on their parents? And it's really, at any point, if you lose your job, you use up your savings. And if you don't have that kind of parental support for a big savings buffer, that kind of homelessness is closer than a lot of people realize. So yeah, it is shocking. I mean, even clients that we deal with at the total other end of the spectrum have been coming to us and saying, actually, we are actually feeling the pinch a little bit here. Things are getting expensive, whether that's just the weekly shop, the mortgage, whatever it may be. But it's a really challenging time. And a lot of that goes back to kind of what we learn when we're children in terms of finances and our financial understanding. A lot of that is formed when we're kind of 9, 10 years old. We're really quite young when we kind of get that financial knowledge, depending on who is looking after us at that point. And that's kind of how it's formed. And if you don't have that from parents or guardians and schools, I don't know about you, but I didn't get much from school when it came to kind of understanding finance and just really basic things like savings, tax, the power of compound interest, and just adding regular savings funds and that kind of thing. All of those things play a huge role in actually where we get to as adults, and what our relationship with money is.
Mm. It's so true, isn't it, that people just don't get educated in this stuff, and it's like, when do we, even as
Yeah,
an adult? And I've been talking to my accountant recently about tax and so on, because I'm setting up a different company for our leadership lab work with Jem Ellison, and it's like trying to get your head around all this stuff, and
yeah,
it's just so reassuring that you have someone who you can go and ask these questions to, and be able to try and work it out. But actually, it's you only tend to ask it when I've got a very specific thing I am,
yeah,
I've got a problem with this, or I'm setting up this, or it's new, I need the information. But day to day, most people don't think about consciously how they spend money or how they
yeah.
save money. And then I guess it's when it goes wrong that people begin to think, I should have done something.
Yeah, exactly. And you're right, and it needs to kind of be the reverse, really. I mean, I found, when I went to university and then started kind of my working career, I had to have a big kind of reset in how I am with my finances and kind of my financial habits. Because I had one parent who was terrible at saving and one that loved spending. So that's what I kind of grew up around, which is great. And I definitely have the kind of treat yourself gene,
Yeah.
absolutely. But then suddenly, you're out in the world and it's your money you're spending. You then kind of think, okay, right, actually, I need to not be doing that. And it takes a really long time to kind of get rid of those habits, because it's like I say, it's things that you've learned from being really young. So yeah, getting your head around, just regular savings, even if that is something like a direct debit that just goes into a little bank account, ISA, whatever it is,
Mm.
um, that you've got something available for you for those nice things, rather than just not having any plan in place whatsoever. But it's really challenging, and it's that kind of thing, whether that's exercise, diet, having those good habits in place are really kind of the foundation when it comes to any finances.
But I guess also like listening to what you've just said, which is really sensible advice. Um, I guess there potentially is some pushback about saving when people are struggling so much to buy the food they need, pay their bills, just the kind of day-to-day living stuff. The idea of putting some of that money almost they don't feel they have
Mm.
aside almost feels like it's just an impossible situation to be in. And I guess with looking at those numbers of nearly a quarter of all people being judged to be living in poverty, actually, how is there still potential for those people to be doing something different that could be about saving or kind of longer term?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's always things that you can do. And I think within my role, because obviously as a financial advisor, our kind of umbrella term is wealth manager. And it's one of those things, the phrase wealth manager, I think automatically puts people off.
Mm,
Um, but I think, financial advice is there not just for, the wealthy. I think everybody should have a financial advisor. Um, Not necessarily because you've got funds that you want to invest. But I know there's a lot of resources online and stuff like that that just give you a really basic financial plan. It doesn't need to be £50 a month that you're putting away. The kind of basis for financial planning or that kind of foundation is having an emergency fund. If you are in that position where you're unable to work, you lose your job, whatever that looks like. Um, but actually, from there, just I think the first step is just kind of figuring out where you're at currently,
mm.
before kind of making any future plans, because then that gives you a really good basis. And you know yourself better than anybody else. And I know there's been times where I'm thinking, wow, things are getting really expensive. And then I kind of reflect on it and I think, actually, Sophie, you didn't need to spend that, or you could have saved here. And I think being honest with yourself about your spending is always kind of the first step, absolutely. If it's more kind of extreme than that, and like we're saying, talking about people who are experiencing things like homelessness, it's more of a case of, okay, how do we get out of that situation? I know there's charities that can support and assist, both from a kind of personal and financial aspect, and those would be kind of the places that we would go to. For example, at the start of this year, I did some work with Women's Aid in Marlow, and they have kind of sessions talking to women in a range of kind of awful situations. And one of those areas is helping with kind of finances, their financial knowledge, just helping people get back on their feet really, and kind of building those foundations from the very beginning.
It's so good that there are so many organizations and you've talked about their organizations and there are some links that people can access to do some planning. We'll make sure we put what we can in the show notes that people can go and access that. I think you made a really good point about being honest and actually looking where you are now. So actually just starting with where are you now? Because
Mm-hmm.
I think for a lot of people, there's that real fear of actually stopping and looking at where I am now because it could be really bad. And so
Yeah.
I don't want to see it. I don't want to know how bad it is. And I'm going to ignore that. And
Mm.
um, there's a real danger in that, isn't there? And well, obviously, it's likely to get worse. But it's about how we reassure people that looking at it is always better than avoiding it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a book that I'm reading at the moment by a lady called Fleur called The Money Pizza. It's really, really good. And I can send you a link to it. But
Mm.
it talks about basically not having this approach of burying your head in the sand and actually, facing your money habits head on and acknowledging areas that are kind of your weak points. And she's great. She's very no nonsense, which I love. And it is hard, in any aspect, having that kind of self-reflection is really challenging. But it's kind of the first step to kind of getting you where you want to be and where you should be.
So the reason we're kind of talking about this at the moment on the podcast is because obviously, I mean, the report coming out yesterday was perfect timing,
Mhm.
as that kind of prompted my thinking as well about what we're talking about today. But obviously, we've had the budget recently. We've got Christmas coming up, which is a hugely expensive time for a lot of families. in terms of thinking about the budget, what has been the impact, or what is the impact, or what's going to be potentially the impact for kind of, average families? So when companies are thinking about the people they are employing in terms of their financial security and so on, what what could be the impact? What could be the alarm bells as a result of that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one really, because I think my day to day and a big part of this role is not even necessarily the advice, it's being kind of the calm in the chaos a lot of the time. Certainly before the budget, there was so much speculation around what was going to come out, everything online. There was this huge whirlwind, and we have had, prior to that, so many inquiries to what people should do. And as an advisor, you can't and shouldn't advise based on speculation, which obviously a lot of the time isn't, what people want to hear. You can only advise on what you know at the time. So like I said, we had all this kind of emails, phone calls, looking for some kind of advice, and it's like, well, this is what we know. We don't know, what's going to come out of this budget. Now, obviously, we've had it, and to be fair, we've had a lot of thank you emails from clients for saying, thank you for not letting me make, these rash decisions, these knee jerk responses to well, we didn't know what the outcome was going to be. The main part of this role is looking long term. If we look at investment graphs and historical information, whether there's been a budget, whether that's the UK, whether it's US elections, anything like that, there's always going to be a bit of a wobble.
Mm,
But actually, all the planning that we're doing is a long term goal. We're looking kind of 5, 10 years. So it's actually a lot of the time. And we've had clients recently who have been worried about finances, work, everything like that. But it's more looking at the bigger picture of actually, okay, this is where we're at now.
mm,
Um, where do we actually want to be in 10 years, rather than kind of focusing on, this slight change in, new government, new, president in the US, and maybe kind of what that fallout from the budget will look like. Still kind of remains to be seen for a lot of it.
mm.
Um, but actually long term, is that going to have a massive impact on retirement and that kind of thing? That's kind of the bigger picture that we look at with clients.
I also think it's interesting, isn't it? Because when we talk about kind of financial well-being and the cost of living crisis and
Mhm.
poverty and so on, we're we're almost thinking kind of about one area of kind of finance and what people have to spend. But there'll be a number of people in employment who perhaps have more of a healthy income, but are suddenly made redundant, or their situation changes. For example, private tuition fee
Mhm.
and the change in that. And although it's very easy for some people to think, well, how lovely of them to have that
Mhm.
option to be able to spend money on all these what they might consider nice things to have compared to a lot of other people,
Mhm.
it is still someone's way of life. So and I'm thinking about parents here who I know in workplaces who are feeling quite stressed because they have children at schools that they have to pay for, and suddenly they're questioning, can we still pay for their fees? And if we can't, what does that mean for their children? And what does that mean for the parent sense of status in terms of,
Mhm.
suddenly a very public acknowledgement that I can't pay the
Yeah.
fees. And all that can erode at people's confidence and just take up a lot of mind space worrying about things. It's not just about not having any money, it's just wherever we are at, however much money we're used to, and it is in our lifestyles almost shaped around, it's suddenly having a change in those circumstances, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And we saw this a lot last year. Where I work in Marlow, it's a very affluent area.
Mm,
And you're right, especially when it comes to money, it is kind of, a point of pride for a lot of people. And last year we saw a lot of people going from, especially with their mortgages, kind of the very kind of nice 1% mortgages that everybody got quite kind of comfortable with, to suddenly being on, 4, 5, or forbid 6%. And especially, like I say, in this very affluent area where historically the advice for a lot of people with mortgages was, oh, over leverage yourself a little bit. What's the worst that could happen? We were then seeing, like I say, the worst that can happen. We're in a wealthy area. People have got these big mortgages, kids in private school, and we've had clients coming in, saying, "I might have to take my kids out of school. We might have to move. If the moving may mean the kids have to go to a different school, it's yeah, a whole adjustment across the board. It's not." It's something that's affecting one end of the spectrum or the other. It seems to be across the board with everybody that we're speaking to at the moment. Um, and that's when having an advisor in your life is beneficial, to look at the areas that maybe we can save, setting up, making sure we've got an emergency fund in place, and just looking at your options in that scenario.
Yeah, it is having almost like that person who's got your back, who
Yeah.
can just help you through regardless of where you're at. But I think it's an important reminder for people in who are running companies to think about all levels of employees, not just who they know perhaps are struggling more. And I guess for me, one of the things that I see a lot, and obviously what makes it relevant for organizations, as well as actually just being the right thing to do to care about our employees, is actually it does impact on how people show up. So if
Yeah.
someone is coming to work, and regardless of what their financial situation is, if they are preoccupied with worry about what's going to happen to me or to my family, or, in terms of paying the rent or the mortgage or
Mm.
being able to, or all the bills or whatever it is, and actually, the reality of Christmas coming up and expectations around that, what the impact that can have on people in terms of heightened levels of anxiety,
Mm.
depression, and so on. Do you see that in when you're working with people in different organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm quite fortunate, obviously, working in a financial firm. Conversations around finance are pretty open,
Mm.
but I'm very aware that that's not the norm, for a lot of people. Even when I speak to my family about finances, there's kind of this, oh gosh, she's just mentioned finances. What's she doing? At the dinner table. But because it's just every day for me, I don't kind of see it as a taboo topic, but historically it is, and it is, still for a lot of people. Um, I think it is really challenging for a lot of people, whether it's finance or anything else. If you're coming into work and there's something at home that's, kind of clouding your headspace a little bit, it is really difficult. And having, someone available that you can talk to about that is, finding someone that can maybe be, secretive or private about those conversations is really important as well. Whether that's at work or a friend or whatever that looks like. But yeah, it's quite an interesting area because it's one that people just don't want to talk about when it comes to finances. And you're right, certainly around Christmas, it's a time, and I'm guilty of it. I love spoiling people and buying gifts, and Christmas, and this is kind of my favorite time of year. But even I have to kind of make a note to myself, like, just rein it in. You don't need to go all out. But it's really difficult. And like I said, the kind of flip side of that is almost the guilt of not spoiling people, and knowing kind of what's the right thing to do. I mean, within my family, my brother and sister-in-law had twin girls earlier this year, which is lovely. And it's amazing being an auntie. But I said, what do you actually need as parents of twins? Do they need more toys, or do you need more like formula for them? Would that be better?
Yeah.
It's maybe not that festive, but it's more practical. Formula's expensive. They're going through it like nobody's business. So actually, that's probably a great thing for them to have. And I've got a very long time to spoil the twins at only other Christmas.
Yeah, but I think it's also a really good point that it might not be very festive, it might be more practical, but if you are reducing someone's anxiety, so that they can be more present with their children, and they can actually switch off a little bit themselves and enjoy
Mm.
Christmas, or what I mean, any time of the year, that actually it makes a huge difference. And
Yeah.
it's about, for me, it's always about lightening the load. So how do we help people uh, kind of put down some of what they're carrying around, that worry in their head, whatever
Mm.
that's about. And if we can find a way of reducing that,
Yeah.
not be all shiny and sparkly and exciting, but
Yeah.
actually it's going to make a massive difference to how that person shows up, how they
Yeah.
sleep. How I can say sleep's another thing that gets hugely
Yeah.
impacted by worrying
Yeah.
about this, and that has a knock-on effect. So anything we can do to make a difference, even if it is buying formula, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, it's more kind of understanding what people need as well, whether that is, from a family perspective, whether that's your colleagues or if you're running a business, kind of what your people need from you as well.
Mm.
Um, it's all about asking the right questions, I think.
So, whose responsibility then is it in a company? Say a company was saying, actually, yeah, you know what, we do want to make sure we are looking out for people in terms of, wherever they're at, whatever their financial situation, that we are making sure that we are supporting them.
Mhm.
Um, who typically ends up with that responsibility? And is that the right person? Like, who should be taking that on? Who's the best placed person?
Yeah, I think typically it tends to fall to kind of the kind of HR culture role within a company. And I think to a certain extent they might be the right person just because they're usually the person who can have those confidential conversations if needed. A lot of people feel comfortable talking to the kind of HR team about it. I think it needs to come from kind of the top in any business. And I think actually asking your people what they want or need. Um, it's very easy to do kind of a blanket, this will kind of help and this will make people feel better and this is a great thing to do, but actually having those, whether it's one-to-ones and whether it's a private kind of survey that you put out to the company, but actually understanding what would lighten the load for a lot of people, where their kind of difficult points are, and making it personal as well, so people are kind of feeling heard and they kind of have a bit of reassurance. I think makes the biggest difference. But yeah, I think making it personal is always the way forward.
So in terms of then thinking about those questions, is it as open as what's the kind of support that you would find most helpful right now? Or are there other questions that you could share that you think actually if HR people or managers or whoever were asking their people these three questions, they'd get some really good insight into what would be most helpful?
Yeah, I think definitely, what do you need? What would help? Having some suggestions, maybe that the company's already thinking about, would this be beneficial? I think sometimes CEOs, leaders can kind of think, oh, this would be great for me if I could do this. And it may work for them, but then you've got an entire company to then think about as well, who have got, young children that need to get to school or, battling commutes or anything like that. Um, so yeah, I think just asking what they think would help. Um, Saying we were thinking about, I don't know, having 3 days in the office, 2 days working from home. Would that be helpful? Would car sharing maybe help? Yeah, so I think just putting it out kind of really broadly to your people, and then you can kind of get a real idea of what would be beneficial. And it may be that the responses you then get are actually fairly similar. And I think the understanding on the other side of that, whether you're an employee, is that obviously for business owners, just a blanket kind of salary increase isn't also, necessarily realistic for a lot of employers at the minute. So being open to different options and just seeing kind of how they could benefit you as well. Like I say, the working from home piece is a big thing for everybody. And I think it helps a lot of people, whether that is just, reducing costs of commuting, petrol, more kind of family time because you're present and you're at home. I think that's kind of helped a lot of people. And I know when they're kind of looking for jobs now, the working from home is kind of an essential for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I like the fact that kind of what it sounds like you've suggested is almost providing some suggestion that these are the sorts of things that we think we could offer. Because
Mhm.
actually, when you do that, you might prompt some thinking that actually I wouldn't even have thought that would be an option.
Yeah.
So actually, to have some combination of some suggestions,
Mm.
well as that blank, what would you find most helpful? So I think it's kind of having that uh, two-pronged approach, I think, is quite helpful in terms of actually just stimulating people's thinking about actually what would really help me. Because often we don't know what we don't know. So it's about
Yeah,
actually are the options
exactly.
out there?
Yeah, definitely. And I think obviously there's a lot to be said, like I say, for those flexible working hours. But I think also putting on sessions, And, you know, from a financial perspective of have an advisor come in and talk to your team about financial planning and just give them some really basic hints and tips about pensions and investments and what that looks like. Because like I said, people don't know what they don't know. And I always think it gets to a point where you don't want to ask those questions. So having somebody just come in and talk about those things can then maybe help somebody without knowing. Again, maybe asking the team if there's an area that you'd want to know more about, whether that is finance, whether that's more you know, kind of meditation and kind of mental health workshops that would help. And yeah, understanding what people actually would like to help and kind of benefit them is really important.
And do companies, many companies in your experience, provide access to employees to get one-to-one support? So in terms of someone who coming into the workplace or doing it remotely, where people can have confidential advice and even just get started with the kind of questions you've just been asking, or helping people just identify where they're at, so what they might need next, and just kind of not to do anything long term necessarily, but it's actually about just getting them onto the kind of first rung of that ladder, if you like, in terms of this is what I need to be aware of, and this is where I need to go next to make sure I'm getting myself into the best position I can be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm quite fortunate in that we do quite a bit in terms of as advisors going to companies. And we also do a bit around financial education in schools as well.
Mm,
I think it's kind of important at both ends of the spectrum.
massively.
But it is quite rare, definitely. And whether that is, you know, going into companies and talking to them about pensions and savings, or even, you know, we tend to, if we've got kind of, you know, quarterly meetings or kind of annual meetings, you know, we'll have a session on well-being and, you know, mental health. And we're quite fortunate that we've got a big company in the background that actually really kind of pushes that. But it is quite difficult sometimes in the smaller organizations. Either the cost of having somebody coming in to do those talks, or just a lot of people maybe think it isn't for them, so then they wouldn't kind of come in and kind of join the session. But again, it's just trying to make things as accessible for people as possible is the key. And just having that information out there, even if you've got kind of an online site that your team can check into and just kind of get some information about, you know, the benefits of meditation, for example, that could kind of help them in their day to day, or kind of 10 financial tips. And again, it does tend to fall to kind of the HR people to kind of pick these things up. We're
Mm.
quite lucky that we've got a great HR team where I work, that are kind of on it with these things and making sure we're all kind of looked after. But I know that is definitely not the case for a lot of places. So I think it's just important to, I think for employers to kind of have that person that they know can speak to your colleagues, your team, and ensure that they've got kind of a safe space basically to talk about whatever it is that's concerning them, whether that is finances or something else. But I think as Brits, we're generally quite private anyway, so it's quite challenging.
Yeah, and I think that whole sense of being able to normalize the conversation is so important. So I'm always talking about the importance of managers, for example, in team meetings,
Mm,
to do kind of check-ins with where people are at and what's getting in the way of them being able to focus today. And that could be stuff that's in work or out of work, and just
mm,
start to have those conversations. And often people are reluctant to open up to start with, but as time goes on and they see other people role modeling that, and they realize that good things happen when that happens, you know, people are opening up. That's
mm,
really helpful. But I think, you know, you were saying about sharing, I don't know, top tips for saving or whatever it might be, access to a particular organization, for example, being able to just almost have that as an agenda item at team meetings, so that when we come together, we're not just talking about what we think is business, but we are talking about the stuff that enables our people to be present. And that means dealing with whatever is distracting them. So if we can have an agenda item that's about something around well-being, and that includes financial well-being, so that includes, you know, did you know about this resource or this organization, or here are some top tips, or there's going to be a talk next week at somewhere, even if it's not in our own organization, just being able to tap into that stuff and just to share that knowledge, even though you're not necessarily getting from people what is going on for them personally, you're
Mm.
just normalizing the fact that we can mention the money word or the F
Yeah.
word, the finance word, without it being without it feeling like, oh, that's really uncomfortable. So it's just started
Mm.
to normalize that conversation, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, I'm very fortunate in that, I have these conversations with clients every day. So I don't necessarily as this really taboo topic, but I know from chatting to my friends, there's kind of this stunned silence when you mention savings or anything like that or pensions. And I think there's a lot of, well, stigma and a bit of judgment as well in terms of, oh, you haven't been investing or you haven't been saving. And I think
Mm.
the biggest thing for me kind of going into becoming an advisor was there's still a big disparity between men and women in terms of financial knowledge, savings, pensions. Um, and for me, I wanted to do something about that. But I think we as women we still feel that we are still behind, especially when it comes to pensions. So actually, it is quite challenging to think, oh God, well, my husband, for example, knows more, or my brother knows more. And they seem to have either a higher salary or a better pension. So it's then difficult to then kind of start that conversation. Um, so yeah, I think the more we do it, the easier it will get.
Yeah.
And like I said, that's why I kind of put a lot online talking about finances to kind of end that stigma and just make it something really approachable for people, so they're not kind of burying their heads in the sand and can just talk about it openly. Because I think the sooner you kind of address your finances, the better. And then you can start, like I say, building those good habits, whatever that looks like for you.
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned about the gender difference because today, as we're recording this, is Men's Mental Health Awareness Day. And I've seen quite a few things on LinkedIn around, men putting on that kind of facade. It's like that
Mm.
face that I'm in my work mode and I can do everything I'm supposed to be doing. But behind closed doors, there's a real
Mm.
sense of panic and they can't share that. They don't feel they're able to share that with people. And that can have really serious consequences. So I was curious to know if you see gender differences in terms of, you're talking about how people think about money and
Mm.
organize money and so on, but in terms of being able to talk about their concerns, their worries about it, do you see a
Mm.
difference in men or women in terms of being honest and being open about that?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I think for a lot of men and men in my life as well, it's kind of the case that, everything's fine, nothing could possibly be wrong. I know everything there is to know about finance because I'm male. There's nothing wrong, everything's fine. And then to the point where it's not. Um, the contrast to women is, oh, well, actually, I'm really struggling with this. And I think as women, we're quite good at saying that we're struggling earlier on. I think men still have this kind of facade of, we're not allowed to struggle as men. You have to, just, and I hate the phrase man up because I think it's awful. But I think a lot of men have been told that, as a man, you are told to provide for a family. And not that that's the, correct approach at all, but I think that's probably a lot of pressure for men to have.
Mm.
And especially when you don't have an outlet to talk about it. It's just that, the constant, okay, well, I need to work to provide for my family because that's my role as a man. But like I say, having no outlet to say, work was actually really tough and I'm struggling with this, or, I'm worried that I can't provide for, my family and that kind of thing. So, yeah, it is really difficult, like I say, versus women who I think we are quite good at saying, work was actually really rubbish today. I'm having this challenge. Yeah, it's really difficult. And I think I've seen some changes, I would say. I think, I'm 29 and a lot of kind of the men that I work with who are kind of similar ages to me are a lot better at having those conversations. Um, but there's still kind of a huge jump between the ease that they have, and I think they find it a bit easier talking to another man about those problems from what I've seen. And maybe that is just kind of maybe the ego thing of talking to a woman about it might be more challenging because then it's kind of admitting that I am really struggling. But I think as long as they've got that outlet, that's the main point.
So is that something then that companies should be thinking about as part of what they might be providing
Mm.
to think again, the depends on the size of the business, but actually, should we be offering a support that's just for men to be able to access with other men if they'd feel more comfortable, and likewise for women to be able to talk with other women, because
Mm.
you've made some good points about men sort of traditionally in some families being the kind of people who organize all the money, and then I know women who just say, well, that's not my role and I don't really know enough about it, but it leaves them quite feeling quite vulnerable after a while.
Mm.
So is there a place for that provision being offered if people have the resource to be able to do that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely kind of touch points that employers could look at where they actually could probably offer something like that. If they've got an employee who's just had a child, that's going to be, something straight away that's going to trigger, some financial worries as they're getting older. And for, both parents, I think if they're going on maternity leave or paternity leave, having those conversations just a bit more in depth and, like have a nice time. And I know a lot of my colleagues, male and female, have that, oh, did you have a nice time off on maternity or paternity leave? I don't have kids, but I'm informed it's not the most relaxing time in your life. But yeah, and they've been met with had a nice time off rather than actually delving. Are you doing okay? I can imagine this has maybe triggered some concerns financially. How are you doing basically, and just kind of going a bit deeper with that. I think the other area, and I have a lot of clients that I speak to about this, is divorce. On both sides of the table. I speak with a lot of women who, have just come out of a divorce, and like you say, maybe if their partner was the breadwinner, and kind of dealt with the finances, which is still kind of the default in a lot of relationships. Suddenly, these women are lost, because they're kind of thinking, right, okay, well, I had this plan, and we were doing this together. For whatever reason, that's broken down, and then they need kind of building that back up again, which is part of what I do. Um, but also kind of as an employer being aware of that, um, and making sure that you're kind of helping that employee where it's needed. And again, the same for kind of male employees that are going through that divorce. If either other half it was the breadwinner at the time, or maybe they weren't, and their expenses are about to completely change. It's just being kind of having those open conversations with the people that you're working with.
Which goes full circle to what I talk about a lot, which is just knowing your people. So
Yeah,
knowing if they are going through challenges outside of work, whatever that might be about.
yeah,
I know someone who was talking about looking after an elderly relative who
mm,
other end of the country to them, and they were having to go and visit them every week. And they said the amount they were spending on either rail fares or petrol was suddenly just racking up, and they were kind of realized one day just how much they're spending on that
mm,
and the impact that was having, and as
yeah,
well as the worry about that relative and the time it's taking, and
yeah,
that which it's very easy, isn't it, just to say, oh, so and so's getting divorced, or so and so's just looking after their
mm,
a parent, or and actually we almost we it's not trivialize is probably the wrong word.
yeah,
It just becomes part of, yeah, so are loads of other people, but we don't really think
yeah,
about what it means for that individual. And but you saying right at the start about personalizing this, making sure we go
yeah.
back to the individual.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, having a background in wedding planning and financial planning is kind of helpful for this because, whether it is a bride who has just brought me kind of a scrapbook that she's had since she was 7 saying recreate this, or somebody saying, I want to retire in 10 years, let's plan it. It's all about managing those expectations, but also be kind of understanding what their goals are and actually what do they want out of this conversation. And like I say, knowing the person is the most important thing. Like I say, whether they've got a relative that they're traveling to, and just understanding what they need and what would actually be helpful for them is so important.
And I like the fact you keep coming back to that, like just asking what they need, because I
Mm,
think when we just ask that question, which can almost feel for some people too simple, like I've just got to come up with something
Mm.
almost quite polished and quite this amazing package. And it's like just start from basics of what someone
Yeah.
needs. And I think some of the other things that stop people asking that question is like, well, what if they say this, this, and this, and I can't provide it? And it's like, well,
Mm.
actually, you're not expected to be able to provide everything that someone needs, but you might be able to signpost them onto someone who can provide that, or signpost them onto someone else who will know who else can provide that. So it's
Yeah.
just about bringing to the surface what's really going on for people and making sure they can access the support. It doesn't mean you have to be the one to solve it all.
Exactly. And I think as well, it's kind of I see it a lot online, kind of the ongoing joke of like, oh, ask for a pay rise, but we've got kind of pizza for lunch or something like that. It's something I see a lot. But it is kind of a good point that actually, providing, lunch once a month or something like that for your team, seems like something that a lot of employers, oh, that might just be a waste of time. It might not be beneficial for a lot of people. But for, that one parent who has drop their kids off at school, run around all morning, not got their lunch with them, had to, sort out a million things, actually then walking into kind of the staff room or kitchen and saying, oh, lunch is provided. And it's just something that can just kind of get off their desk a little bit and just sit and have a break is actually quite invaluable. And it's stuff like that that is actually really kind of beneficial to people.
And of course, as soon as you start providing a lunch between this time and this time, you've got more
Mm.
people coming together and eating
Yeah,
together and therefore socializing together. And
yeah,
that's when you get people really opening up about, building those relationships and that trust and, rather
yeah.
than being in their silos at their desks, which can, that's obviously a concern as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're quite fortunate with the company that I work with that we have smart working, we've got flexible working. So people, have got kind of a bit of freedom, which is amazing. But then there's days when I'll walk into the office and everybody just happens to be in that day.
Yeah.
And it's lovely. It's nice to see everybody, catch up with everybody. They may not be my most productive days in the office because I'm chatting to everyone, but it's nice to just check in with everybody and see how they're doing. We've got a very good kind of culture within work, and kind of going back to what we said, we have something called the three Bs. So be amazing, be responsible, and build relationships. And it's quite a nice culture to have, and it's something that a lot of people kind of factor into just kind of their day to day. And it's one of those things that you'll forget, and then you'll get kind of a reminder about it, and you think, oh, you know what, actually, yeah, I could be maybe building some more relationships, or where am I not maybe being responsible as to my colleagues or something like that. But having that kind of culture for your companies is really important.
And it's so important because a lot of people, like when you just said that those days in your office, you might not be your most productive, but actually the value in what you are doing in terms of investing in those relationships. And that's the stuff that when you kind of got these ideas that just pop into your mind, you can share them with someone, test them out with someone, or help someone else out if they're struggling with something, or just pick up on what someone else is saying about work or no, not work.
Mm.
And that stuff you can't, it doesn't come under kind of a specific category. It is just that catching up with people. And I love the fact that's about being amazing, being brilliant, and building relationships because that's stuff you need to have time to do. That's not structured down to the minute. And everyone's talks about, you know, it's kind of billable hours, and you've got to have everything's
Mm.
got to be really tightly planned. And it's like, where do we have the space to just be? And it's those moments that we create the space to connect and to build those
Yeah,
relationships that actually people start to talk about what's really going on. Or did you know that we've got this provision, if someone's struggling, or did you know about this organization, or just beginning to share more about what's really going on for us and how to support each other. That comes up much more naturally.
absolutely. And I always try and kind of factor into my day. I think for me, so I'm dyslexic, definitely fall under kind of the neurodiverse umbrella. So when I'm kind of structuring my day, I kind of I don't know if you've heard of the Pomodoro
Yeah.
thing where you kind of do like 25 minutes, 5 minutes. So whenever I'm on kind of that break, that's my kind of like, right, go away from your desk, go talk to somebody for 5 minutes, and then come back. So it's kind of doing two things at once, which is great. Keeps me productive. But also means that I'm always checking in with the team, so it's kind of factored into kind of how I build the time. And I mean, especially if I've not seen somebody for a while, or they've been away or something like that. It's just yeah, just making the time for people is really important.
So before I ask you about some key takeaways, is there anything else that you think you would want to share with listeners today in terms of the sort of things just to look out for, be aware of, ways of supporting, anything that you haven't mentioned yet?
I think, especially when it comes to finances, having just a really basic plan and addressing your habits is the most important thing. And then going from there, that's kind of the first step always.
Mm.
Um, and I think if you then want to speak to somebody, it's really important to kind of reach out as soon as possible. There's a lot of information online that's really accessible. That you can access, even if that's something like citizens advice that you just want to, get some kind of hints and tips, a bit of advice with.
Excellent. So, people who have, because I think you've talked about quite a lot of ideas today, and um, I suspect some people will be scribbling down, kind of like, oh, yeah, I could do this, I could do that, and definitely we'll put some links in the notes for this episode. But if for people listening, what would be your kind of key takeaways that you think actually it is about going and identifying where I am at or going and getting help? Is there anything like what would be your kind of summary of actually what people should take?
I would say just keep it simple. And one thing that I always focus on, especially in a world where we've got kind of budgets and governments and everything going on, is to basically just control the controllables. You can't change everything. There's going to be things that are going to have uncertainty. But make sure that you're focusing on the things that you can control.
I love that. Control the controllables. Brilliant. I was talking about that yesterday about something entirely different context to finance, but that is a key message. Sophie, thank you so much for joining me today. If we'll put your contact details in the notes. But if people want to reach out to you, I'm assuming the best way of doing that is probably via LinkedIn.
Yeah, LinkedIn's great. My email's great. I have a few people who message me, but I've got kind of an Instagram page with kind of financial tips on there as well, if that's of interest to anybody. So yeah, anywhere really. I'm usually fairly contactable.
Wow, that sounds awesome. Thank you so much for your help. And you've been a great help, and I'm sure you'll be a great help with all your resources and support that you can offer. So I'd urge people to reach out to you. Thanks so much, Sophie.
That's all right. Thanks, Lisa.
What have you taken from that conversation to think about or do differently? How has that inspired you to develop practice to bring out the best in people, including yourself? This podcast gets more listeners when people like you give a thumbs up on Apple or wherever you listen, and especially if you leave a short review. So please help be part of the movement towards creating workplaces that really provide the best experience for their people. And do reach out to me directly to discuss your challenges at work and ideas for development. If we're not already acquainted on LinkedIn, let's connect. All the links you need are in the show notes. And if you join the club, you'll be the first to hear about relevant updates and free downloadable resources that are part of developing practice and performance. Thanks for joining me today.